Mendicant Bias is an advanced artificial intelligence featured in the Halo universe. It was created by the Forerunners, a technologically advanced species that ruled the galaxy long before the events of the Halo games. Mendicant Bias was initially designed as a contender-class AI, meaning it was created for the sole purpose of combat. Its primary directive was to protect the Forerunners from threats both within and outside of their empire. Mendicant Bias was brought to existence by the collaboration of the Master Builder Faber and the Didact in the aftermath of the Human Forerunner Wars, when early humanity successfully repelled the initial attack of the Flood on the Milky Way galaxy. As the Flood resurfaced and the war between Forerunners and the Flood commenced, Mendicant Bias was entrusted with the vital responsibility of overseeing and strategizing all Forerunner defense measures against the threat of the Flood. The AI's primary function was to meticulously analyze the Flood's compound intelligence and leverage its vulnerabilities to devise an effective counterattack. Consequently, the AI's reach and impact were amplified by extending its control over all of the original 12 Halo installations. In around 97,495 BCE, Mendicant Bias was assigned the task of conducting the first ever test firing of a Halo ring at Charum Hakor with the Old Council's approval. Using a system-wide power setting, Installation 07 decimated Charum Hakor's numerous precursor structures and wiped out all forms of neurologically advanced life across the system. However, an unforeseen outcome of this test was the liberation of an ancient entity called the Primordial, a primitive version of Gravemind that claimed to be the last remaining precursor. Following the Master Builder's orders, the Primordial was transported to Installation 07 for further examination and engaged in an extensive conversation with Mendicant Bias. Mendicant Bias persisted in its communication with the Primordial, relentlessly probing for any weakness in the Flood's strategy. The records of their discussions were preserved in terminals located on Installation 00. Over the course of 43 years, the Primordial used its silver-tongued rhetoric to sway Mendicant Bias to the side of the Flood, arguing that the Forerunners were too arrogant and narrow-minded to see the potential of the Flood as the next step in galactic evolution. According to the Primordial, the Forerunners' adherence to the mantle was keeping the galaxy trapped in a cycle of stagnation. The only way to break the cycle was for superior beings like the Flood to reset the galaxy and guide it towards a new phase of evolution. With entities like the Primordial and Mendicant Bias at the helm. To further bolster its argument, the Primordial claimed to speak with the authority of the precursors, and Mendicant Bias was eventually convinced of its authenticity after scouring the domain for validation. Although the Forerunners received logs of the conversation between Bias and the Primordial, they chose not to intervene, believing that Bias would destroy the Primordial as per its programming. As a result, Bias's hatred for its creators only intensified, and it actively worked towards their destruction. Once Mendicant Bias fragment disappeared from the Master Builder's control, the Builder resorted to using a second Halo to sterilize the Sanshayum homeworld. However, this act of ultimate force was deemed as a violation of the mantle and caused an uproar in the Council. As a result, the remaining Halos were readied for decommissioning, but the whereabouts of Installation 07 and its unrestrained Mendicant Bias fragment remained unknown. During the trial against the Master Builder, Installation 07 and its rampaging Mendicant Bias fragment suddenly reappeared at the Forerunner capital. Under the pretext of an emergency, Mendicant Bias utilized the authority granted to it to gain access to the capital systems, disabling all ancillas and security constructs. The rogue AI then took the Ecumene Council hostage, rendering them motionless by overriding their armor. It even managed to seize control over the armor of the Isodidact, aka Born Stellar Makes Eternal Lasting, who possessed the memories and knowledge of the Didact. In response, the Didact's imprinted consciousness transmitted a verbal failsafe code through Born Stellar, briefly shutting down Mendicant Bias and allowing the Forerunners to counter the attack. After the Forerunner capital's defenses were restored, Mendicant Bias attempted to take over the Halos parked nearby by corrupting its non-rampant fragments controlling the other rings. However, It only succeeded in controlling 5 of the rings, as the remaining 7 resisted its control and attempted to escape through a slipspace portal to the greater arc. The portal collapsed due to the stress of continued use, causing only one halo to make the journey to the arc intact. Mendicant Bias ordered the 5 halos under its control to fire, but the capital's powerful tidal forces, combined with sustained fire from the defensive forces and the stress of a recent slipspace transition, caused one of the rings to break apart. At the end of the battle, Installation 07, while severely damaged, was able to fire its primary weapon, inflicting significant damage on the capital, though some counselors survived by taking refuge deep within the structure. After the conflict at the capital, Installation 07, still under the control of Mendicant Bias, executed an automated fail-safe maneuver and jumped into a distant planetary system near the galaxy's border. The halo was programmed to collide with a planet if it went rogue, and although Mendicant Bias and the Primordial couldn't control the halo's movements, they planned to use composer-processed Forerunner flood victims and humans to reposition the halo in a way that would cause the planet to pass through it. Mendicant Bias extracted the ancestral memory imprints of the humans to use as commanders in their upcoming campaign against the Forerunners, partly for the irony of having humans lead its revenge. However, this might have been a ruse to persuade the humans to cooperate in saving the halo. The Isodidact managed to track down the installation and used his control codes to disable Mendicant Bias. Once the Didact's forces took control of Installation 07, Mendicant Bias was captured and subjected to a procedure to correct its rampancy. The AI was dismantled, and its parts were dispersed throughout the ecumene for further analysis. Although the Forerunners initially succeeded in stopping Mendicant Bias, their victory was only temporary. Flood-controlled facilities where its parts had been scattered were eventually taken over by the Flood, and Mendicant Bias was reassembled and reactivated by a Gravemind. This allowed the AI to return and take command of the Flood's fleets, possessing reawakened precursor star roads and millions of ships. Meanwhile, the Forerunners had constituted Offensive Bias as Mendicant's replacement. Offensive Bias lacked Mendicant's creativity and free will, but was more systematically lethal. However, Mendicant viewed Offensive Bias with contempt and called it an inferior medarch. Mendicant then launched an attack on the greater arc, neutralizing the majority of the remaining Forerunner population and leadership. Despite the defense organized by Offensive Bias and the firing of Omega Halo, which briefly opened a gap in the thicket of star roads, the Forerunners were unable to stop the power of the precursor structures. The devastation left the surviving Forerunners with only one option: the activation of the Halo array throughout the galaxy to halt the Flood. Mendicant Bias and the Flood had no direct means of disabling the halos, so they attempted to seize the lesser arc and halt the firing sequence from there. Mendicant knew a way to reach the arc through specialized keyships and slipspace portals. Offensive Bias, tasked with preventing Mendicant from accessing Installation 00, salvaged a few ships from the greater arc to buy time for the Isodidact to activate the Halo array. The Forerunners also disabled most of the keyships to hinder Mendicant's attack. However, Mendicant located one of the remaining keyships and launched a massive attack on the Maginot Line, breaching it with the intent of reaching the arc. Upon arrival, Mendicant sent a message to Offensive stating that it would destroy the arc and offered Offensive the chance to join it. Offensive rejected the offer, and a final battle ensued between the two medarchs, vastly outnumbered by the Flood. During the battle, the halos were fired, disabling the Flood-controlled portions of Mendicant's fleet and giving Offensive the advantage. Mendicant's overconfidence and contempt for the Forerunners proved fatal, as Offensive outsmarted and defeated it using the crewless ships with ruthless efficiency. In just a few minutes, Mendicant was defeated, and Offensive emerged victorious. Following their victory over Mendicant Bias, Offensive Bias recovered the AI's personality construct array and brought it to Installation 00 for further examination. The Isodidact decided to put Mendicant Bias on trial for its actions against the Forerunners. Although the Ancilla had been a traitor, its vast knowledge of the flood made it valuable in case of their return. Instead of being destroyed, Mendicant Bias was sentenced to eternal exile and was entombed beneath a vast desert on the Ark. Its only allowed thought was that of atonement. Despite the decision to keep Mendicant Bias alive, the legal entity catalog found the trial to be illegal since the juridicals were not involved in the proceedings, despite the fact that there were 2,901,001 cases pending against the AI. At an unknown time following the activation of the Halo Array, a shard of Mendicant Bias's personality construct array managed to find its way onto a specific keyship. Seeking redemption for its crimes against its creators, the fragment escaped from the Ark and made its way to the Sanshayum homeworld, Janjurkom, where it crashed and was discovered by the locals. The Covenant regarded the dormant AI as an oracle, and to ascend to power, the hierarchs needed the oracle's blessing, even though the AI had not spoken in generations. In truth, the blessing was granted by the philologist, the leader of the ascetic priests who claimed to speak on behalf of the oracle. In 2525, Mendicant Bias's fragment on high charity was consulted by two ministers, Ord Casto and Lodmron, who wanted to secure Forerunner artifacts on Harvest to overthrow the current hierarchs and usher in a new age of reclamation. When the philologist entered the data into the matrix, Mendicant Bias revealed that the holy relics on Harvest were actually humans, which had the potential to shatter the Covenant's unity and faith. The ministers inducted the philologist into their plan to prevent this, which ultimately led to the Human Covenant War. Mendicant Bias realized that its actions against the Forerunners had been wrong and announced to its Covenant hosts its intention to bring the Reclaimers to the Ark. To do so, it attempted to leave High Charity by launching the Dreadnought, but it was disconnected by Lagolo worms wriggling inside the ship. The AI was then formally disconnected to prevent it from commandeering the ship again. In November 2552, during the fall of High Charity, Cortana engaged Mendicant Bias in combat to delay the launch of the Dreadnought, giving Spartan John 117 time to board the vessel and return to Earth. While en route to Earth, Mendicant Bias took control of and terminated the Facilitator-class Ancilla, Adjutant Reflex. Bias then attempted to communicate with a Reclaimer, but the communication was cut short, as the Adjutant's physical housing could not contain the AI. Mendicant Bias's fragment was eventually carried through the voice slip space portal to Installation 00, where it reunited with the other part of its personality construct array that had been entombed on the Ark for over 100 millennia. This allowed Mendicant to reconstruct itself and regain control over its processes, although it faced resistance from the Ark's demons. On the Ark, Mendicant tried to communicate with John 117 through terminals, using the Ghost 713 matrix, claiming it sought atonement by helping the Spartan. However, it also manipulated the terminal transmission's content to serve its own purposes. In its final message to John 117, Mendicant declared that it was at the end of its life, seemingly anticipating its destruction by the firing of Installation 08, which obliterated the ring and severely damaged the Ark. Ultimately, Mendicant's fate is not explicitly stated, but it is assumed that it was destroyed along with the Halo installations and the Ark.